When asked the question where to record this film, the first thing that comes to my mind would be Australia. And I'm going to tell you why. So, Australia is pretty much like a prettier, more interesting version of the United States. They operate a lot like our country, and the economy is pretty similar, but it's a foreign country, basically. So, Australia is prettier than the U.S. Tasmania is actually part of Australia. They've got a bunch of mountains along the east coast, and the size of the continent itself is pretty much the same size as the U.S. And they have the Great Barrier Reef, which extends 1,245 miles along the northeast coast of the continent. Way cooler than the U.S. And the west coast is covered by a desert plateau that pretty much extends down the better half of the west coast. So, needless to say, if you're looking for a place to shoot a film, Australia is probably the place to do it. You've got water, desert, and beauty all in one continent. The government is a lot like the U.S. They use democracy. The government's power is vested by the British monarch, who is actually represented by the Governor General. Currency is pretty similar. They use Australian dollars. And it's actually worth more than U.S. currency. So 75 cents in U.S. dollars is actually equal to 1 Australian dollar. In terms of GDP, in 2015, their GDP was 1.241 trillion. Their real GDP growth was 2.4. Their inflation rate was 1.9, and their GDP per capita was 65,400. In terms of enemies, Australia doesn't really have any enemies. A lot of people like Australia because they kind of stay out of people's business. But there are a few countries that Australia would choose to not deal with if they had the chance. And those countries are Malaysia, Indonesia, and the Solomon Islands. In terms of labor force, there are about 12.5 million labor workers in Australia. And those consist of industry workers, agriculture workers, and service workers, basically. With agriculture being the lowest percentage of labor workers in Australia. In terms of imports and exports, their main exports include coal, gold, meat, wool, aluminum, iron ore, wheat, machinery, and transportation equipment. So basically, they sell coal and steaks. In terms of imports, they import machinery and transport equipment, computers and office machines, telecommunication equipment parts, crude oil, and petroleum products. Now, in terms of exports, they're exporting about $184.4 billion worth of exports yearly. And then in terms of imports, they're importing approximately $208.4 billion. In terms of other population demographics that would be somewhat important, they had a very widespread religion base, from Protestants to Catholics to Christians to Buddhists to Baptists to Muslims to Hindus to the Pentecostals. And don't forget the Presbyterians and the Lutherans. And the Uniting Church people, with most of them being either Protestant or Catholic. It's actually really odd. The lowest percentage of people are actually Pentecostal or Hindu. And some more population demographics. Their main trade partners happen to be China, the United States, Japan, Thailand, Singapore, South Korea, India, and Germany. So they're trading with the better half of the world. And their literacy rate is 99%. Obviously, a country that has a 99% literacy rate has to have good schooling, a good economy to provide that schooling, and people that want to teach those children. And their unemployment rate is ridiculously low at 6.2%. So they have jobs in Australia, guys. They have jobs.